So today we're going to be hearing from three of our partners. We're going to be hearing from Alina Kasprowski from the Bucharest Community Foundation in Romania. We have Urmila Shrestha from Tewa, Nepal Women's Fund, and she's joined by her colleague Basanti as well. And then from the Dalia Association, we have Lina Ismail and Rasha Sansor. Many of you on this webinar, I know the Global Fund for Community Foundations and have worked with us, some of you for some time. For those who don't know you, we have been supporting the development of local philanthropy, community-led, community-owned philanthropy for the past 14 years. And we work with a growing network of organizations around the world. So local funds, foundations, grant makers, women's funds, socio-environmental funds, national public foundations, all of these institutions who are doing two things that make them often a little bit different from many of their civil society peers and allies. One of them is that they are local grant makers. And actually, you may know that around the Global South particularly, there aren't that many local grant making organizations and organizations who deliberately use grant making as a development tool rather than make grants on behalf of somebody else in a more of an instrumental conduit regranting kind of a way. So grant making is one of the things that distinguishes this set of organizations. And the second is the mobilization of local resources. And that's the bit that we really want to talk about today in particular. So last year, during the height of COVID, we made around 50 grants to our partners around the world, basically to support COVID response in whatever way they felt was most relevant or appropriate. What we were keen to do as we were making grants out around the world was not just to make sure that we got resources to where people needed them most, but to really understand what we learned, what we could learn through this cohort of grants. What did this all mean in terms of what was going on in the world, and particularly in the impacts of COVID-19? So as well as making the grants, we conducted a survey to find out how people were responding, how they were seeing the situation. Many of you on this call received grants, so you were part of this, you were implicated in this survey. We also held a series of calls with partners over a period of months, just as an opportunity for people to check in with each other and to try and make sense of this radical craziness that was happening in communities all around the world. And throughout, we were constantly trying to work out how we make sense of this hyper-local response that was going on around the world through our network of partners, and how we could kind of hold it together as part of a larger conversation around more systemic kind of change, particularly in the area of development and philanthropy. How could we understand these multiple actions that were going on in ways that could be translated to funders, to larger actors in the development system, and in the ways that might encourage them to pay attention to this emergence and this grassroots mobilization. And two of the things we wanted to do as a result of this sort of grants plus the learning was to develop a collective learning agenda within the community of community philanthropy, but also to try and be more effective in articulating and making sense of this emergence, of this action, of what it meant to other actors, particularly in the philanthropy and development space. So from the initial findings of the survey and the conversations with partners and some of the online tea and coffee sessions we held, we saw a number of things. Firstly, that our partners, who themselves, as I've mentioned, are often grant makers, so they're working with local ecosystems of grassroots and community organizations. They were quick to activate and organize their networks. There were trusting relationships there. I was talking to a colleague earlier today who basically said, if no one came knocking on your door during COVID-19, you shouldn't have been there in the first place, that you weren't relevant. They were responding quickly, turning things around quickly, reinventing themselves, reinventing programs, thinking differently, responding to what communities needed. And in particular, I think, and interestingly, really supporting other community leaders to play a leadership role. they were busting silos. I think, you know, you had organizations handing out PPE in the morning and worrying about the shrinking space and the response of government in the afternoon. Human rights organizations wondering if they should be giving out hand sanitizers, women's funds worrying about food security. This idea that COVID didn't really focus on a particular issue of the world. It impacted the world in so many different ways. Many of our partners were mobilizing people and resources. And again, this is something we want to concentrate on in today's conversation. And they were building bridges between different parts of the community. And we'll hear from Alina, that was very much the case in Romania, of really using the network to build connections and facilitate action through the networks that they had. Many people were concerned about things they hadn't really thought about before. Food security, the gendered impacts of lockdown. If you're a women's fund, this was obviously nothing new to you, but more on community development issues, seeing that this was having a significant impact on particular parts of the community in particular, and you know, effects on vulnerable and marginalized groups and things like that. So one of the things we also did was to try and link back these findings, these observations of what was happening at the community level with this larger manifesto for change, which the Global Fund developed with some of our partners a couple of years back, which is around the idea of creating, so I have this is the original tea towel. If you were there in London in November 2019, you may now be drying your dishes with this beautiful item. But the idea of the system that we want, the philanthropy and development system we want. So we also asked partners to rank which of these elements on the manifesto for change they thought were particularly important in the context of COVID. And I've highlighted 3 of them. So this idea that communities have an inherent power and can be unlocked. And the idea that suddenly who was a donor and who was a beneficiary kind of got all a bit mixed up. It was really people helping each other to the extent that they could. Another one, the idea that external funding must recognize and build on what's already there. And I think during COVID, we saw that a lot of external funding got stuck in the system, that grants were tied up for very specific activities that couldn't be untied, or else that money didn't actually reach the ground at all. And finally, the idea that actually assets are more than money, that we have other resources at our disposals, particularly within communities, which are infinite and non-financial, so knowledge, trust, networks, and so on. So what we tried to do for this whole kind of program of work was to support partners where they were to do the things they needed to do, but also try and aggregate this data and make sense of it in the context of a larger kind of conversation around change. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to ask Alina, our first speaker, if she can share the experience from Romania. Are you there, Alina? I think
yes.
You're going to share your screen.
I'm here.
So yes, Alina's going to take 10 minutes just telling us what the Bucharest Community Foundation and the Community Foundation network in Romania did during COVID. Alina, over to you.
Yes. Just a second to share my screen. And yep. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to tell a story about how Romania supported itself. Romanians on an individual level worked together in the face of a crisis, which we all felt throughout the world. Just a bit of context of where we were as a community foundation before last year. Bucharest is the capital city of Romania, which is a country, for those who are quite far away, which is a country in the Central Eastern Europe. It is a city with 2 million inhabitants, and although Romania is considered to be among the poorest countries in the EU, we still have a GDP which is higher than Berlin or Madrid. So it's not particularly a city with social problems. As for the Bucharest Community Foundation, we had been together for around for 8 years as a local fundraiser and a grant maker. And so far, we have supported around 500 projects with more than 2 million euros disbursed. Since we do not have really huge problems in terms of social causes, we focused on supporting community leadership rather than a specific area like environment or education or gender equality. We've done all of these things, but with a focus on supporting community leadership. That was before the 15th of March, 2020. On the 16th of March, this is what we could see in the city center of Romania. And I'm sure you have your own pictures from all around the world with empty streets everywhere. In Bucharest, on the 16th of March, we started our first lockdown quite early in the stage of COVID. It was less than 3 weeks after the first case of COVID and with less than 200 cases of COVID throughout the country. So we seem to be quite safe, but we weren't. And we had very good reasons to be afraid. Some of you may know the poster of this movie, which is a documentary coming from Romania, nominated for the Oscars. It is the story of a fire in a nightclub in Romania, which resulted in showing the very poor quality of the medical system in Romania, and also the very poor quality of the political system. According to the Economist, we care system. We had a lot of direct contacts with Italy and Spain, which last year in March was at the height of the COVID pandemic. And we had a massive diaspora returning from cancelled seasonal work. Figures spoke about 500,000 up to 1 million people coming back from Italy and Spain, not being tested and hurrying back home to their families. We have a severe material deprivation rate, which is 3 times higher than the EU average, which makes a lot of people, up to 40% of the Romanian population, very vulnerable to crisis because they do not have savings, they live from one day to another, and in case anything happens, they're extremely vulnerable. Also, as some of you may have seen in the collective movie, we have a very high distrust in authorities and we feel we are on our own and we need to protect ourselves. This is why last year on the 16th of March, we felt that the battle was personal and each of us could fall victim to the disease, ourselves, our families, or our colleagues. And that is why a lot of Romanians decided to give their support, give their money. The entire Romanian civil society raised more than 30 million euros to purchase medical equipment and everything which was necessary and the state didn't have. We at the Bucharest Community Foundation, however, decided to take a different approach. We decided that we are not specialists in medical equipment, so we would not get involved here, but we would look somewhere else. Hello to the cat of Jenny. This is an image from no more than 50 kilometers away from the Bucharest city. It is an image of a village and a family which lives under the poverty rate and it lives as it used to live 200 years ago. Needless to say, these people were working as daily workers and they didn't have any savings. They didn't have any hygiene products. They didn't have food to spare. And this was a situation which could be seen everywhere in Romania. That is why we did a partnership with a local bank, which is ING Bank. ING Bank donated its own money, but also invited its customers to donate via Home Bank, which is the online platform, mobile banking platform. We also partnered with 17 other community foundations throughout Romania, and we set up to develop an emergency fund for vulnerable communities. Our focus was to distribute things which were of the most basic necessity, like food, hygiene kits, medical packages. We supported more than 10,000 people in only 7 weeks. 174 communities, 22 countries, and 46 NGOs supported. We couldn't have done this without the local knowledge of our colleagues from throughout Romania. And it was amazing that we had weekly calls for support, and on a weekly basis we received tens of needs of support from our colleagues, because they knew their communities best in a way in which neither us nor the bank or our donors could have known. Apart from food, we were also delivering hope and laughter, and this is something that I guess is part of the infinite resources which are not material and which were so highly needed during those times of lockdown. And then as the lockdown was lifted and everybody was saying that everything is gonna be fine, we know it's still not fine 1 year later, we set up to do something different. Swimathon. Swimathon is a swimming and fundraising event which we have been organizing for 8 years now. So far we supported 180 projects. We had 2,500 swimmers, close to 20,000 donors, and we raised €500,000 in quite small donations. And we were asking ourselves, what can we do in the year of the pandemic? Of course, we couldn't have a fundraising and a swimming event, that was for sure. But what else could we do? We felt that there is a need for us, and people wanted to donate, not just for the emergency situation, but to know that things are going to be fine, and they are going to continue to be fine for multiple projects, not just for the crisis. This is how Swimathon looked before. You cannot imagine this in a time of pandemic. And this is how Swimathon looked last year. We couldn't be crowded in a closed environment at the swimming pool, but our swimmers went the extra mile and they swam in all kinds of remote places, at the seaside, in lakes, in private pools, and actually on the couch, because Swimathon turned from a swimming and a fundraising event to swim at home. Swim at home could be done by anyone as long as people raised money. Our surprise was that last year we raised more money than in 2019, and it was something none of us could have imagined. Our partners were telling us that we should cancel Swimathon for 2020, but we just didn't want to do that because too many projects would have been missing their funds. And to our surprise, it was more successful than a year before. The reason we believe this happened is that we felt like that we are in this together, and it's not something that any of us could do separately, but only we could do as a group, as a collective, as a society. We started trusting each other more than we did in the past, and the way it worked was that we needed to find specialists who knew how to deliver, how to raise money, and that was us, how to find projects, which was the local network of community foundations, how to reach the people who were most in need, which were the NGOs that we supported. The only way to go forward is together as well. The pandemic is not over, and I'm sure that there will be a need of togetherness going forward. And it's not the state that should and will do everything for us. It's all of us together, stopping to wait for somebody else to come and help us, and doing what is needed ourselves. Mulțumim, which is thank you from Romania.
Great. Thank you so much, Alina. And I think that the power of your story of what happened in Romania is so much bound up with Romania being a kind of a young democracy, and that philanthropy, community philanthropy, is really a story about it is about a mobilized citizenry and people organizing themselves and their resources. And what's so powerful is that map that shows the sort of the wiring of community philanthropy and civil society in Romania that you were able to activate You know, it was already there. You were able to get resources, connections through the system so quickly, through a network of actors who already knew the community and were able to respond very, very quickly. So I think not to lose sight of that fact that the connection between community philanthropy, not just as sort of charitable giving, but kind of really citizen participation. And as you described it, people knowing what the limitations of the state were and the lack of trust towards the state being rerouted towards institutions like yours. So I hope we can come back to that in the conversation too. Brilliant. Let's turn now to, we'll travel by Zoom to the other side of the world, to Nepal, where Urmila is going to share with us from the experiences of Tewa, the Nepal Women's Fund. Urmila, over to you, please.
Can we close down this presentation?
There we go.
Please wait for a moment. I'm sharing my presentation. Can you?
We certainly can, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny, for this opportunity. And Tewa, Tewa is a typical Nepali word that means support. So we are here to support women from the off the ground from all over the Nepal. Tewa is a women's fund. It established in 1995. So we are 25 years old. And from the beginning, we are raising locally here in Nepal. So we have 25 years of local fundraising, we can say that. So Tewa is for the word itself. So why we are doing this community philanthropy? Why we are raising locally? Community philanthropy for the advancing women's right and shifting and practicing philanthropic approaches that as mentioned, giving. There's a giving culture in but most of the giving goes for the religious work. So we are trying to educate, we are trying to shift that for the women's movement, for women's empowerment. So, and of course, we also want to mobilize local resources, local, of course, skill, knowledge, time, this kind of resources that we want to. And we are trying to strengthen women's leadership, women's fight, that is for the collective power. This is Tewa's program. I want to share very quickly.
Oh, I think Urmila's connection's just frozen. Let's just give her a minute in case it settles again. Oh, I think we've lost her altogether, have we?
I think we've lost Urmila, but we might
Sorry.
have
Oh, no, she's back.
I'm back.
You're back.
Sorry.
No problem.
Sorry.
Do you want to share your screen to presentation mode as well? And then we can see the slides.
I did share.
Yeah, it's shared, but if you want to press that little box down at the bottom into presentation mode, otherwise don't worry, we're good.
Okay, this is Tewa's.
There you go.
Under the community philanthropy, we have the philanthropy program that is local fundraising. We also mobilize our volunteer to talk about the Tewa's work, to talk about the women's issue to their own community, and our volunteers also collect fund from their own community. And we also have the children's program. And second, we have a grant. Whatever we raise locally, that all goes for the grant. And this is especially focused on the women's, because as a women's fund, we are giving our grants to the women's group of the ground. So we are not giving only grant, we also build the capacity of our partners for the leadership, for the collective voice. So we all know about that. And we also have the learning monitoring unit. So we want to see what is the change, what is the learning from our women's group are doing from the ground. That learning school can be shared to the larger group, maybe the funders, for again go back to the other women's group from the community, and that will be also helpful for us to improvise our program itself. And we also started our mentorship program. We found and we learned if we invested in the organization development, organization sustainability, second line leadership, the organization could be sustained for the more time, because when they have a fund, they have resources, they can mobilize their resources within the community. But once they don't have the fund or the resources, we found the organization little less active. So we started a mentorship program in and we also invested, Tewa also invested in land and building program, where we share our facility, we open our facility to other organizations. They can come and use our facility. With that, we can generate revenue from that, our facility that goes for the Tewa's admin and Tewa's sustainability. So this is our annual fundraising target. As I share, we are doing local fundraising from 25 years old. So we set the target for the year, every fiscal year, we set a target for 30 lakhs, that is 40,000 USD. And for that, we do annual donation, annual events, campaign for the year. And as I say, we are not only raising money, we are also raising awareness on women's rights. And the COVID, when the COVID happened, so we have to rethink our fundraising events, because as Elena also mentions, we cannot gather many people. So we discuss within a team, then we introduce peer-to-peer fundraising campaign. What does that mean? So if, as I say, we have a large network of the human researchers within the Tewa. We have more than 500 plus grantee partners from all over the Nepal. We have more than 800 volunteers from the beginning. We have more than 40 staffs. We have the board members, staff, general member, past president, and founder. So we are trying to tap that network, and we introduce peer-to-peer. That means if I bring 10 new people, new donor to Tewa, and I ask 1,000 rupees per person, that means I can raise more than 10,000. So we also say rupees 3,000 to 5,000, because there's a diverse community, as we say, volunteers, grantee partners, members, staff. So it's up to them. So we introduce through our various meetings. We also take advice from our volunteers, our grantee partners, about peer-to-peer. They also encourage, if you if you set a target for the fundraising, we also have to time limit, so that we can fix within the time limit, we can raise the funds. So this is our peer-to-peer fundraising campaign, which we introduced after the COVID. And we also do as many programs, many events from the beginning. And for the year, we set 4 to 5 fundraising events. That means we gather the people. This time, when we plan for the tree plantation, this is also our annual fundraising events. We sell our saplings to the potential and the regular donors. But this time, when we think for the tree plantation, and this is quite far from our office, which is we collaborate with the grantee partners or the local community. If the particular site area where we choose the site area, if there is our grantee partners, we collaborate with the grantee partners. If not, then we will coordinate with the other group of the local community. This time, without our presence. So this is what we are trying to mobilize our local resources. Our grantee partners did these fundraising events in their own area, and whatever raise money, we target to raise 2 lakhs rupees. During the COVID, we almost reached the target 1 185,000 from these events we try to raise. That means if you are willing to raise, we are not gathering many people at the time. In our last previous, when we did this kind of fundraising events, Tree Plantation, we bring our school students, donors, and we gather more than 200 people at the same time. But this time, with the limited people, our grantee partners did this program for us. So there is a possibility, even in the COVID, even the earthquake, we never stop our fundraising, local fundraising. So this is our fundraising target. As I mentioned, we are doing from 25 years old. I wanted to share with you more than amount, and this is our data, donor data, individual, institutional. And whatever we raise, I mentioned, we give grants to all over the Nepal. This is the Nepal's map. We are surrounded by the China. Our neighbor is China and India, two big country. Until date, we disperse grant to, we have 77 districts all over the Nepal, and we disperse to 70 districts, 528 women organizations, and 774 grants. That means few grantee partners are receiving multiple grants. So we are looking for your idea, thoughts, suggestions. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Urmila. Just thinking of what's the same and what's different from the two stories so far. Obviously, completely different parts of the world. Alina was saying Bucharest is a wealthy city. Well, Nepal is really often characterized and dismissed as an entirely aid-dependent country. And yet this is an organization that was established with local philanthropy in it right from the start, when its founder and our just recently retired board chair, Rita Tapa, decided that another way was possible. And it wasn't just about money, it was really about mobilizing and building a network. So it was only recently that Tewa actually started to use money it received from external sources for its own grant making. So for the first decade plus, all grants were made with money raised locally. And as Urmila shared just now, all resources contributed. So in dollar terms, so the $2 contribution from a donor or a $5 contribution from a staff, all that money goes into making grants. And so you start to see the cycle of sort of transparency of how resources can flow through into communities and back again. And similarly, that map of, if you've got 500 partners across a country, that's a built network that you can activate. And probably finally, and it's not the topic of today's call, but the stories of women who've been involved through engagement with Tewa, through the groups that Tewa engages with, that being a journey around women's rights, education, awareness, and plenty of stories of women who've worked with Tewa, taking political office, getting voted into local elections. And so really an integrated, holistic way of seeing the world. And as Urmila said, you know, even during COVID, where nothing seemed possible, actually they just found different ways to do it. They activated the network. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to put this little link in here, so don't click on it because it might start playing, but you might want to share it. This wonderful short video that Tewa has done recently around the local giving. So let's turn to our last input and from Dalia Association, and then after that we'll open it up for conversation. So Lina and Rasha, over to you, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Let's just put it on presentation mode. So hello again. I'm Lina from the Dalia Association, and along with my colleagues Rasha and Hida, we're here to talk about community philanthropy in Palestine and what we do at the Dalia Association in this regard. First, we would like to say that Although community philanthropy as a term is relatively new, but it's actually a part of the indigenous culture of people, where people would come together and support each other. In Palestine, the word al-aune, meaning support, like Tewa, represents the indigenous solidarity system, where people would convene together to support each other in several events, like in the harvest seasons, in social events. And here, as you can see in this old picture, people of the village are coming together to support in building of a house for a community member. So talking a bit about the Palestinian context, to give you a bit about an information, as you may know, Palestine has been under the Israeli colonization for 73 years, where around 750,000 Palestinians were expelled in 1948 from historical Palestine. And as you can see on the map on the right, what is left for Palestinians to live on while holding on to their Palestinian IDs is scattered areas in the West Bank and in Gaza. Palestinians living in what's called now Israel are considered now second-class citizens with no recognition of their Palestinian identity. So, and of course, this led to people revolting in a series of uprising events, most significantly the first Intifada. Here we witnessed, we consider it as the pinnacle of community solidarity and philanthropy in Palestine, where we witnessed emergence of local committees and unions for community mobilization, providing services such as education, health, food production, psychosocial support on a volunteer basis. And we also witnessed horizontal leadership and collective decision-making based on local resource mobilization. So everyone was a giver here, everyone was a contributor in the national struggle for liberation. Here, as you can see, this is a document that we found from the Palestinian Museum Archive, and it's basically a plan for the mobilization committee of the General Union for Palestinian Women, which included objective on mobilizing women and enhancing their participation in the national movement. This included providing information and training on issues such as first aid, crisis management, hygiene, and also participation in national campaigns such as olive harvest and demonstrations. So women's role was at its best in the Intifada and working collaboratively together. If you want to know more about community philanthropy and solidarity in the first Intifada, I urge you to watch these two movies, The Wanted 18 and Naila and the Uprising. So moving forward in the mid-90s with the signing of the Oslo Accords, where the situation in Palestine actually went to a downward spiral with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and the continuation of the colonization, and the influx of international aid, which created more dependency on external resources in general and globalized markets. The consequences for that is there was a further fragmentation of the Palestinian community, loss of social fabric and cohesion, and loss of people's power and their belief in their own resources. And this affected their ability to mobilize and participate in the development process and also in the liberation of their nation. Thus, the Dalia Association came with the aim, it was established in 2007, with the goal of regaining back our right and power to mobilize our resources for a durable development through participatory grant making and providing grants based on community decisions and in their needs and priorities to what is best for them. So why community philanthropy? We adopt the community philanthropy model as it supports the community, community-led solutions that are based on mobilizing and linking local resources, cash and non-cash, and also emphasizing their value and reducing the dependence on external resources, thus contributing to a stronger civil society. And this is hopefully our goal in the future. Rasha, it's your
Yeah, so to continue and show you examples how we practice community philanthropy, we have the ongoing campaign Fundraise for Dalia, where we encourage local giving and people from the diaspora or friends in solidarity to donate. And we also encourage in-kind donation, which I will explain in the next few slides. So we have developed a fundraising toolkit. We dropped the letter D here because we believe that we have to have fun when we conduct activities in order to achieve the change that we want and support community initiatives. So inspired by that toolkit, we do these events on a recurring basis. For example, every semester, we hold the quiz night where we support students with partial scholarship. Next slide, please. And then we go to the public parks and we hold the smiling station. Basically, it's a face painting event, and you can see that these children are the youngest donors who support local community initiatives. So it's really inspiring to see. At the same time, we encourage connection of the diaspora to the homeland through direct donation to community initiatives. Here we have an Australian lady who did a tea salon and raised around $900 for the agricultural fund that we have at Dalia. And we have this annual event, which is our model of giving circles. It's called the Social Change Auction, where people convene for a couple of hours and listen to an entertainment per paragraph, and at the same time fundraise through live crowdfunding to support local initiatives. And I can show you in the next slides how exciting it is, because you can see people throwing the money in the donation baskets and the excitement of counting until you reach the thousands. So it's really exciting. Another thing we have is the Dukan, which is the secondhand shop, which embodies the concept of community philanthropy. And here we focus on the in-kind donation. So a lot of the items are donated by the community, and we sell them at a budget price to go back and generate income for Dalia's community programs or activities. Here are some photos from the items and the people at Dukan. And these are just a few examples of what we do and how we practice community philanthropy.
So speaking about the period of the pandemic, we saw several initiatives popping up in Palestine, where it also represents bringing back this value of community philanthropy and solidarity. There were local campaigns by local committees to distribute food packages to people in need. There were initiatives to volunteer in certain areas to support the planting and farming. There were initiatives by the village council along with the people together to farm certain lands and provide produce for all residents of the community for free. So we witnessed some wonderful initiatives. Should I continue? Okay, so for Dalia, let's say we continued working on creating spaces for solidarity and support among each initiatives. But at the same time, unfortunately, unlike Romania, we haven't reached to the full potential of online giving. And but we continued our efforts on the ground to create space for civil community to convene, taking into consideration the safety measures in that time. So one of our colleagues started this initiative to support community initiatives, youth and women and craftspeople through convening in a space and making this market of initiative where people would come together, support each other, and also buy their products. We also focused, as Alina mentioned, on the fun and happiness part that people really needed during that period. So we provided our space for certain certain activities that generates income for our programs, but at the same time draw a smile on a child's face and make this kind of beautiful activities like yoga practicing, doodling, and dot mandala. At the same time, our shop Dukkan remained open with delivery delivery to homes. So what we envision for the future is that we believe that community philanthropy is crucial to unlock people's power and enhance their local ownership and agency to drive the wheel of change. And we are also going to work on a national level to scale up this kind of discussion and include community philanthropy in policymaking agenda, and also cooperate with like-minded entities to being part of a global movement to push for and to advocate for giving for change. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lina and Rasha. I always like to hear the story of the Dalia Association. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? I can see that Nora Murad is on the call. Nora was one of the founders of Dalia back in 2007. And in fact, the Global Fund was established only in 2006. And I think it's important to say that our fates have been inextricably linked with organizations like Dalia that we've traveled with, and Tewa and others along the way, that our story has been a response to other people's stories and, growing this community along the way. I do think it's important to say also, that as Lina observed, Dalia still is dreaming of the new system, but is operating in the old system, and so was constrained by your ability to respond during the pandemic because of the restrictions on the grant funding that you had, which is the story of many civil society organizations around the world, that people had money in their accounts, but they couldn't use them to respond because they were tied up in projects. So just a couple of reflections on Dalia, and then let's open it up for some comments and conversation. And I think Dalia, like Tewa, and to some extent, I guess, the Bucharest Community Foundation, these were all, well, Dalia and Tewa particularly established as a rebuke to a system, to the failures of international development aid, and a belief that things could be done differently. And in a country like Romania, the importance of civil society being a place for people to interact and be, that was not just the place of the state. And I think understanding that the drawing the dots, the art crafts, these are things that go into a larger bucket which is around long-term systemic change, that there's a political framing to this which emphasizes people, it emphasizes their resources, and it creates spaces for people to engage. And often international development aid can write people out of the story. People aren't given the opportunity to decide and participate. And one of the things that Lina and Rasha didn't mention, because it's not the topic of today's call, is your use of participatory grant making to start getting community members to see that they actually can be part of decision-making processes as well. But this whole idea that I hope that all three stories have really kind of highlighted, that this is just a different way of being and doing. It's around democratizing philanthropy and development, and designing institutions that start with people and their resources and build out, rather than that start with money and then the problem of what you do with it and how you create structures to respond to that. So we have some time for some comments and questions. We will try and do this in an organized way. If you want to raise your hand, or if you want to put an H for hand in the chat box, you're welcome to do that. Or maybe we'll take a few comments or questions. You can do old school raising your hand, but I might not see you. So yeah, the floor is open for anyone who wishes to ask a question or make a comment. Although everyone seems to have been left speechless. No one, you're not going to make me talk for the next 20 minutes, are you? Because you know I will. Anyone from the community philanthropy sort of world who has shared something who has experienced something similar or different during COVID. I know some of you have spoken on previous calls. No, okay. Well, no one has anything they wish to add, so I will turn to our panelists and say, listening to each other, would you like to try and do, still digesting the presentations? So Esther has raised, well, okay, now I can see hands raised and now going in multiple directions. I can't actually multitask. So Esther is raising the question around how to sustain this increased solidarity beyond the crisis. And I think that's a real thing, in a sense. These institutions are designed to kind of capture and add this activation of citizenship into the buckets of community philanthropy. But what was that somebody from Bond? Was that you, Yoli? Here, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Do you want to add that into? Just introduce yourself as well.
Oh yes, hi everyone. I am Yoli. I work at Bond and supporting work around how we can, how could the INGO sector can accelerate locally led development. So I guess my question is, how can INGOs be true allies for this community? So what role, how can we truly support this work that is being done and that is truly community led?
Yeah, really good question. So what does this mean? You know, how can INGOs understand this work, international NGOs understand this work and respond to it? So any other, we've got two comments. One from Esther is, how do we sustain it? I know we chatted a bit about this the other day, is like, what do we make of all of this? The question of what role for other actors. Any of our speakers want to comment, or anyone else who's here, because we are by no means any of us experts, we're all doers in this. This is everyone's conversation. So from our panelists, anyone want to respond? And if anyone from the audience wants to respond to Yoli or Esther's question as well, please do.
Jenny, can I share my experience? I don't know whether it responds to the question or not, but I can. So Tewa is giving grants to the women's group, and this is the bottom of progress. That means we priority and we give, I mean, always we prioritize their own idea, their own need. We know we are sitting in Kathmandu, in the capital city, we don't know the context, real context of the community. So whatever they wanted to be supported from us, we support for that. So it could be the different kind of activities or the project for them, but they are well known how to tackle. They know their own problem. They know how to address that. So this is our working style from the beginning. Maybe the relationship building is also important. They think if we thought we are all know, we have the knowledge, we have the resources, and we have the access. And if the community, we go to the community, people thinks we have all the things, but that is not true. They have their own knowledge, they have their own experience. So we have to respect and we have to acknowledge that also. Maybe this is the relationship of partners, not the grantee or the donors.
Thanks, Urmila. I think that, well, Shuba's saying INGOs need to be more courageous. And I think of how many people I've met who work in INGOs who've been in Nepal and have never heard of Tewa. Like these worlds don't meet. So maybe even just sitting down for a cup of coffee between these silos to say, well, actually, how could a women's fund with multiple relationships across the country really add value to a program in a way, as you said, as a partner, not as a sub-grantee or contractor? I think really, really important. Does anyone of you, does anyone want to speak about how do we sustain this? I can see other questions coming along too. So let's, Hilary, why don't you raise your question? And yes, at this point, either any of our panelists or anyone who just wants to join in the conversation too. So we'll hear from Hilary, and then Alina's raised her hand.
Yeah, it wasn't so much an ongoing question as a response bond.
Do you want to introduce yourself as well?
I'm sorry, yes, I'm Hilary Gilbert. I'm English, but I'm the chair of the Community Foundation for South Sinai in Egypt. It was about the question, how can international NGOs help? How can we support work like the sort of inspiring things that we've seen in the presentations today? And I think at least part of the answer to that is, in a sense, it's easy for us to sit and look at these presentations and say, wow, that's fantastic, that's inspiring, look what they did. What funders can do, if they really want to help, is to be able to make that judgment and trust organisations on the ground and invest in organisations on the ground, trusting that they know what needs to be done, but recognising that they may not turn out with amazing, inspiring results, that the results might be different, or that the learnings might develop in the course of a grant that might turn your direction and might make the most effective intervention something quite different from what was planned in the first place. And it's having the flexibility and the trust to work with local partners without expecting necessarily to have stunning results every time. That is something that funders can do, because the situation on the ground is so volatile in a lot of countries. It changes all the time. Unpredictable things happen, freak weather events happen. You cannot always know how things are going to turn out. And giving local organisations the head to develop their own solutions to problems as they arise, that would be an act of faith and trust in us that we would all hugely appreciate.
Thanks, Hilary. So that idea that there are institutions that might know how to respond in a way that's relevant, perhaps not in a way that was cooked up 6 months beforehand and now needs to be stuck to, and that is actually, we saw during COVID, the relevance of what people had planned and what they were able to do for all of us, I think was a big issue. Okay, I've got a couple of hands up. Alina, over to you, and then Anik, and then there's a question from Hajar about engaging young people. And again, I think the floor is open now for all of us to contribute as experts to the extent that we all do a bit of this. Alina, over to you.
I was thinking now, while I was waiting with my hand raised, whether my comment will contribute or will open another topic of conversation. Because when I was reading Hilary's message about how can we continue to increase this solidarity after the pandemic, I was thinking, how can we also make sure that we don't paddle too much like the famous mouse in the mouse cage, because we want to do more and more and more, and we are encouraged, and we don't want to stop. Because also we are looking at what toll this year has been taking from us. And maybe sometimes the question is, should we stop a little bit? Should we just rest and see what is out there? Should we just look out of the window from time to time and not only in the Zoom windows? I think these both go hand in hand, because otherwise we will be forced to stop at one point when we can't do it anymore. So again, I'm not exactly sure if I'm answering her question or I'm proposing something completely different, but that was my thought.
Thanks, Alina. But if you take a metaphor of a sort of ecosystem of people, community action, connections, and any soil, if you keep planting the same thing in it time after time, gets exhausted, and like systems need to replenish themselves. And I think that was one of the things that really came out of the survey data we collected too, is just the mental health impacts on people trying to make sense of their own lives while also trying to support communities. And actually, if you're not running in a 2-year project where you've got to deliver everything immediately, this has time, it must ebb and flow, mustn't it? And so it's how do we sort of embrace that narrative without saying it's success or failure in the projectized view of the world, but rather maybe ebbs and flows. Anik, from Indonesia for Humanity. Hello.
Hi, thank you, Jenny, and all. I don't know whether my response will answer the question or not, but I want to share the reflection in some of Indonesian NGO about the role of NGOs when the pandemic, the COVID coming. So we then, and before of that, NGOs in Indonesia already suffer because a lot of INGOs already left Indonesia because we are not a high-peaks country anymore. And with pandemic, so we need to adapt faster and we have no choice. But in the other side, we think that maybe this is the time for us to really seriously thinking to going back to our locality and to see the resource in our local community. And even though it's not easy because there is no clear regulation from the government to support the social justice issues in Indonesia, but for charity, people will just give it to you. So another reflection is actually also maybe this is related with the presentation of Urmila and Lina. I always asking and really curious about how to manage the volunteer with such a big number, because here in our organization, Indonesia for Humanity, it's not easy and it's more difficult now because of the pandemic situation. I think this also relates with some of the question when how to involve youth in the situation that they can danger their life. So I want to know further about how you deal with this situation when you cannot meet physically, and because fundraising should be fun and it's not fun anymore according to me. Just meet in the very limited situation and very sometimes having Zoom to another Zoom is very tiring rather than before. Thank you, Jenny.
Great, thank you very much. If anyone wants to comment on Anik's points of like, yeah, how do you keep people involved and yeah, the fun in fundraising? And then in the chat, we've also got the question around, you know, to what extent were any of you involved in this work on the call, were able to keep young people involved and engaged in your work? Were you? We'd love to hear some examples of those. The question around power, the framing of the work in attempts to shift power. I'm sure, Dalia, you wouldn't mind talking about that, the sort of the decisions that support a more radical redistribution of resources. Maybe you want to talk about your participatory grant making model, but yeah, the floor is open for anyone to respond to these or add to what I think is a series of growing questions for all of us, is how do we make sense of all of this and join the dots between it? Rasha, I can see you're nodding, which to me looks like you're ready to say something. She's pointing at Lina virtually via.
We'll start with the last question about the participatory grant making. So in our cycle of support, we provide grants to youth initiatives and women initiatives and community initiatives by convening with people from the community and starting this discussion about how to bring back community support and philanthropy in our work in supporting community-led solutions. And the people, whether it's youth or women or in general, the community in general, depending on the project and the program we have, they start coming up with certain solutions and community initiatives based on their needs. And we focus on local solutions that are friendly to the environment, provides the social and cultural context. So it adheres to the social and cultural context. And as well, if they are economic, then they should be supporting local economy. These are the very like general criteria that we work on. And then the youth starts, for example, formulating their project ideas. Then a convening would happen in the village or in the community where they get to vote on the best initiative that supports their community and we are a facilitator in that process. So we're not voters and we're not controllers of the grants, but rather we're facilitators of the process, and we provide the grants accordingly. Then we follow up with technical support and capacity building if needed for each community initiative according to the nature of the initiative. I would also like to just thank Hillary for her input. I totally agree with having international donors having faith in community foundations and not being very restrictive in terms of what should be done. This is very helpful, and also sharing the risk of what will come along. This is very much resonates with us as well. On the youth engagement component, we've been working through the last year, for example, and volunteers on an online basis. So just keeping in contact, in communication, showing that we care with the youth that we work with. And that requires not only a professional relationship, but it also requires a personal relationship. So in our line of work, it's also personal. So we keep this line of communication, this base of trust, and we see how this flourishes when we are working on the ground with them. So it's just keeping line of communication and trust between us and them, and exploring ways to support each other. Thank you.
Can I also add, because it's related to the context that Lina explained in the presentation. So the current youth that we are working with are currently the children or post-Oslo children, let's say. So they have internalized these donor projects that you cannot achieve your community initiative without getting funding from a bilateral donor, or you cannot think out of the box, or you don't know, they don't have the technical know-how to mobilize local resources. So this is one thing that we struggle with while we're implementing our youth program. But then we break away from all of these constrictions and that are imposed on the youth, and they start believing in themselves, and they start believing in mobilizing the resources, start believing in the capacities of their community, and they trust in this this solidarity that is within the Palestinian community. So it's really important, which really raises their confidence and the status of their mental health in a way.
Thanks, Rasha. Just on the questions around power, the comment from Essie and the earlier one from Shahina, I think this issue of how one understands giving, does giving create an obligation or does it create a space at the table? And how for institutions like this, I mean, fundraising, grant making, these are just tools, and you can use tools for good things and you can use tools for bad things, but it's really how do you hold the lens of power and inclusion? Clearly, if you're a local fundraiser, you know, and you can raise $100,000 from one person in your community, that gives that person an enormous amount of power. Do you want to raise $1 from 100,000 people in your community? What's the right balance to create the spaces where you're bringing people together as givers in the way that Tewa does? Anyone who gives is a giver. There's no hierarchy attached to that. So it's really actually how do you apply a lens of power and how do you read your situation so that you know if you're being pulled in one way or another. And we know that it's very easy for an instrument like a community foundation mandated to raise money to tilt towards those who have money. But the opportunity here is actually how do you activate the community in a more holistic way so that whoever engages, whether they come to your events, whether they receive a grant, whether they sit in your advisory community, how do you create institutions that model an idea of participation and flattened power? And clearly this is an emergent sector, an emergent conversation. I think these sorts of building this fabric of this conversation with practitioners like many of the people on this call today becomes critically important, because people are doing it wrestling with these questions every day in a really, really powerful way, and the ability to support and accompany each other in this process is really, really important, because this isn't just about money, and yet there is money and money has power. So it's, you know, how do we hold a grasp of all of this complexity while we're trying to kind of do our day jobs, which I think is a very, everyone knows from the last year, are just exhausting in so many different ways. Does anyone want to have any final comments in the last few minutes that we have together? You're welcome. I can see Vernon, yes.
Yeah, I just responding to some of the observations you'd made there, Jenny. And there's I guess part of it was coming into mind.
Introduce yourself, Vernon.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, Vernon Ringland. I look after Youth Bank International, which is it supports participatory grant making with young people, and maybe 20 organizations who are reflecting those values in I guess a challenge to them. And I suppose that's the point that I was wanted to make, because behind this there is this conversation in our head about confidence and self-doubt about the genuine involvement of young people in the governance of our organizations, and the challenge to governance about making up the rules about what would it mean for young people to have some power to be ceded to them, the authority, and what can they authorize in the context and customs of the situations that they find themselves in. I would say that the work can often be slow and messy and chaotic. As a practitioner who is really challenged by some of the very issues at the forefront of looking at power in terms of, especially around money and giving, around agendas that they set themselves. And I would love to see more of that conversation about that struggle, because I think, to me, that's where my heart lies also, in terms of there is much to build on here that is more than goodwill, but it also is about looking at how genuinely young people feel that they want to get behind this and be involved and included in their communities. Let's make that point.
Great. Thank you. Well, Vernon, you land us in a nice place to end, which is, I think, we see increasingly the power of having these conversations together and putting heads together and sharing practices and creatively adapting what others are doing elsewhere. I think that is one of the real powers of this movement, that we do have these channels, these wires through which electricity, knowledge, resources can flow. So I would just like to thank all our speakers for generously sharing their stories today. And yeah, as I said, this is the first of this sort of learning community place to kind of engage and come together. So we encourage many of you, many more of you, to come together and organize similar kinds of sessions and offer our platform to do so. But for now, thank you, Wendy, for organizing us and sending us off and bringing us back correctly, and everyone else attending. Have a good rest of your day, and thanks again. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Be healthy.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.